demonstrations across the country calling for defunding the police and an end to unchecked police violence, the Austin City Council made history by unanimously passing a city budget and announcing $150 million in planned cuts to Austin police. Although only $20 million or so will be immediately removed from the department's funding, the cuts won't result in a decrease in the size of the police force. The cuts nonetheless stop the growth of the Austin police force and shifts resources to community and public health-based programs and strategies. This vote has been heralded as a major symbolic victory for the Black Lives Matter movement, but has also provoked a conservative backlash. Shortly after the Austin City Council's vote, Texas Governor Greg Abbott announced that he would consider punishing any city government that cut police budgets by permanently freezing their ability to increase property taxes. Governor Abbott was joined by Republican lawmakers who also threatened retaliation for the budget cut and are considering passing additional measures to combat the budget cuts. Last week, Governor Abbott went further, announcing his intention to have the state take over the Austin Police Department. This week, Abbott publicly pressured other Texas elected officials to sign a Back the Blue pledge to not cut police budgets. Governor Abbott and other conservatives have talked about Austin's budget as a fundamental attack on law and order. The governor tweeted, quote, "We can't let Austin's defunding and disrespect for law enforcement endanger the public and invite chaos like in Portland and Seattle." A dark money PAC called the Fight for Austin PAC has sprung up in response to the council's budget and is raising money for candidates running against city council incumbents, claiming that the budget and the council's humane policies for people experiencing homelessness are a threat to public safety. The group has bought billboards warning residents that the police have been defunded and to enter at your own risk. The rhetoric of those opposed to the Austin City Council's reforms mirrors the stance taken by Donald Trump, who has made defunding or defending police budgets a central theme of his re-election campaign. Shortly after Abbott's condemnation of the Austin City Council, Trump used a similar line of attack against Biden, calling the former vice president a puppet of left-wing extremists who are out to, quote, eliminate our police, unquote. Biden, though, supporting measures for reforming the police, has not advocated for defunding. Governor Abbott and Trump's rhetorical strategy of painting police reform as an invitation to chaos, crime, and violence is an old tactic for Republicans. 50 years ago, Richard Nixon famously campaigned on law and order against the backdrop of popular protests against the Vietnam War and racial segregation. The backlash has prompted a discussion among organizers, policymakers, and reformers about how to protect sensible reforms from disinformation and attack. To discuss this issue, we are joined by Representative Joe Moody, Councilmember Greg Casar, and journalist Jessica Pishko, a writer covering criminal justice reform for The Nation, Type Investigation, and The Appeal. Welcome to all of you, and thanks so much for joining us. Representative Moody, Governor Abbott wants to make police funding the key issue in all the local and legislative races happening this year. Why do you think Republicans are following his lead on this, and what do you think they should be focusing on instead?
Well, I mean, I think they followed the governor's lead on this because he seized on the issue as a wedge issue and has cast it in a false light. Right? When you oversimplify this issue, you look at it through a binary lens of punitive. You know, this is a punitive measure, whereas those of us on the reform side of things think about these changes being made as transformative. You know, defund means lots of things to different people, and what form that takes is kind of the conversation you've seen emerge in Austin. But I think in Austin and in other cities, what we're looking at is investing in different responses, right? The idea that the police should not be a one-size-fits-all approach for every single issue that happens in our community. You know, everything that exists isn't solved by police and prosecutors. And so ultimately we need to have a more robust discussion than a pledge that it says, look, we're not taking money from police simply to take money from police. We are doing it to invest and make a budget decision so that an individual who's suffering from a mental health crisis is responded to with a mental health professional who's unarmed, who has the ability to handle that situation. And those are the types of discussions that we need to have. I think, you know, when you talk about it that way, you have a much larger support base for these reforms. I think that's why the governor and others have tried to oversimplify it and try to make it look like a you're with us or against us type discussion, which it certainly isn't. It is reminiscent of the things that you talked about and the fear mongering. That's certainly playing to an element of their base who apparently are ready to be terrified of everything except the pandemic.
So I'd like to talk about that fear mongering. You led the Criminal Justice Reform Caucus, so you're no stranger to opposition to police reforms. What is the role of police unions in creating that fear mongering, creating that partisan fear campaign that we're seeing right now?
Sure. I mean, there's a good example of it here that we went through last session in 2019. I mean, I'm someone that if you go to my office, you'll see literal awards and plaques for me and my staff on work that we've done for law enforcement, for specifically CLEAT. And it's because we've worked on issues like if an officer's injured in the line of duty, do we want them to be able to file a workers' comp claim without being fired so that they have protections for their employment? So when unions work on things like wages, like benefits, like working conditions, those are their natural places to work in. And those are good places to work in. But again, you have some like CLEAT that are all or nothing approach. And so when at the same time, I carried a piece of legislation that said, if someone dies in police custody, that the recordings, the files for that incident, they can't be hidden away forever under the Public Information Act, that we wanted to change that law. I was essentially enemy number one. And so this is a group of entrenched, kind of entrenched lobbyists that they don't really tell the truth to their rank and file officers. And if they did, I think those folks would be shocked about what's going on at the Capitol. They make things very, very simplistic. These are the good guys, these are the bad guys. And that puts a very vague but very real pressure on every legislative office because everyone has a police or law enforcement union back home that is going to come knocking on their door. And so when we don't treat these issues with the seriousness that they deserve and we get into this all or nothing mentality, then you have bad results. And that's what this particular union has been engaged in. When they get outside of the lane of wages and benefits and working conditions and are getting into protecting conduct that is indefensible.
So, we've talked about that all or nothing approach and the simplification, right? Like what they say you're trying to accomplish. In your own words, what are you trying to accomplish? And specifically, what kind of reforms should we hope to see out of the Criminal Justice Reform Caucus in the next legislative session?
Well, I mean, I think that we could talk about a myriad of issues, and there are dozens and dozens that intersect with the justice arena. Policing is a big part of that. Drug enforcement reform is a prime example. If you want to reduce needless police contacts with Texans, then refocus policing on dangerous crimes. Stop arresting people and throwing them in jail for small amounts of weed. Let's stop treating trace amounts of cocaine as a felony level offense that needs jail time and start treating it as a public health issue. Maybe stop busting down doors in the middle of the night with no knock warrants because there might be some drugs in a house. These are the types of things that I think you'll see people fighting for that move resources in a smarter way. I think you'll see us dip into some traditionally controversial items like the death penalty, which we've touched on before as a caucus. There's a number of policies we can get into, but ultimately the goal of the caucus is to be a clearinghouse for information and a driver of the discussion. So in a very real way, it exists to do the opposite of what you saw of the governor's pledge, not to stifle debate, but to encourage it, to talk about what we can do to depoliticize these issues and get a consensus built around smart policy. That's why it's intentionally a bipartisan caucus. It is meant to foster that discussion and not meant to push people into their primitive camps and let them stay there, and the result being bad outcomes for people in Texas.
Do you anticipate any bipartisan, compromises on this? What's the major barrier to both the discussion and getting some real change here?
I mean, sadly, I think the tack that's been taken by Republican leadership recently on this issue is the major barrier. When you have a group of members like the Criminal Justice Reform Caucus, like I said, intentionally bipartisan, 13 Republicans, 13 Democrats, that are fostering a broader discussion on these issues, and then you throw things into a very hyper-partisan environment for discussion purposes, you do damage to the very real issues that we need to build consensus on. And my hope is that we will have clear-minded approach to these issues after the election is behind us, and we can put aside some of this partisanship. I mean, it is probably the largest hurdle that we're going to have to overcome is the hyper politicization of these issues that is ongoing right now. We need to reject it. These are important issues. Defending the status quo should not be acceptable. The status quo didn't work for Sandra Bland. The status quo didn't work for Tatiana Jefferson. The status quo doesn't work for numbers of people in Texas. And that pledge was all that was reinforcing the status quo. So hopefully we can get past the politics of the moment and get back to the policy making.
Thank you. Appreciate you trying to break through the noise, and we'll get back to that discussion. Greg, this budget has been heralded as a historic achievement, and as an organizer yourself, you've always been highlighted as you've highlighted the importance of grassroots movements, and not just this idea that politicians are going to pave the way for reforms like this to happen. Can you tell us a little bit about who was responsible for making this budget happen and how it all came together?
Yeah, I'm really glad to be on, and I think that's exactly the kind of question that we need to be discussing, which is, why are we seeing change? And we're not seeing change because the politicians have changed. We're seeing change because people are talking to their neighbors. People are pushing their elected officials. People are making phone calls as well as marching in the streets. I really believe that it's when the people lead that the politicians follow. And you saw that in Austin, and you're starting to see that all over the country. It was just 1 year ago that we passed our last budget. And in that last budget, I proposed maybe a $700,000 decrease to the growth in the police budget, not even a cut to the police, but a reduction in their growth in order to fund victim services and mental health care, which again, go directly to a public safety purpose. Let's still hire more police, just hire a few less, and do better by our survivors of violence and better address mental health issues. And we weren't even close to a majority vote just a year ago. And now here we are a year later with a major transformation, a historic transformation of Austin's police budget this year. But it really is important about the momentum it builds in years to come. So I think it's really important for people to remember that this isn't a permanent change, that people need to continue to get out to vote, to organize, to hold their elected officials accountable, to hold elected officials accountable that are fighting against the movement for Black lives if we want things to get better. Because things don't get better just with one budget vote. It was an important moment that showed we're on track to undoing generations of over-reliance on policing and mass incarceration at the detriment of, and frankly, at the defunding of social services, mental health care, housing, and the kinds of things that actually prevent violence and crime in the first place. So if we want to, get ourselves to a place where we undo that damage, we can't stop doing this work, changing public opinion. And the governor understands that, and that's why he's trying to slow down that movement and stop that change.
As a follow-up, what's been your response to, colleagues or even other elected officials who've said, you know what, we don't have the votes, or you don't understand, we're in Texas, or, these arguments about there's not having the political will to move forward with changes? How have you responded to that in the past?
Even though we're quote unquote, even though we're in Texas, I mean, this is frankly a progressive place when you talk to everyday people. And it's a place where the change is so clearly and so badly needed, right? It was just up the highway where Sandra Bland was stopped and then so needlessly died. It was in our own city here in Austin where David Joseph, a teenager, was killed naked in the street because we sent a police response instead of a mental health response to his mental health crisis, right? Botham Jean killed so needlessly, again, here in Texas, right up the highway from us. And so it is a place where we need to make this change more than anywhere else. And frankly, oftentimes where Texas leads, the nation follows. And too often that's been in the wrong direction. And so this is a real opportunity for us to really do the right thing. And I saw my colleagues on the council really listen to the stories of everyday people. And that's why we made this change. We knew that it wouldn't be politically the easiest road to go down. We've seen the governor lash back against us when we were just trying to ban single-use environmentally destructive plastic bags, which was just kind of a small thing. He had a whole thing about the plastic bags, or he wanted to cut a tree down at his own house, and he was mad about our tree rules. And so we knew for sure that if we were going to be standing up for Black lives and for a transformation in public safety policy and civil rights, that he would do this. But if we just hide from it and decide to not do the right thing because we're worried that that, as we saw in the previous civil rights movements, that there would be backlash, then we're continuing to do the bidding of the status quo by being too scared. So we had to take the right step. We put together something that was thoughtful, a $20 million immediate reallocation, and then continuing to shift dollars over time as we build new and better systems. But of course, we're still facing the backlash, no matter how thoughtful the plan is.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about that backlash. This isn't the first time the city has come under attack from moderate social reform. We also saw the state legislature step into the reverse. The 2017 paid sick leave ordinance you and your colleagues passed. How has this latest imposition by state government on the Austin City Council differed from what we've seen in the past, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I sponsored the law here in Austin for our city to catch up to many other cities across the country. And frankly, every advanced economy in the world has paid sick leave laws. And in a pandemic, it makes perfect sense why we have those. People shouldn't go to work when they're sick, and you should pay them while they're staying home, because it could never be more obvious. And we saw the governor mobilize against that. But what we're seeing that is different in this case is that now they're starting to have a press conference about it every week. They're starting to come up with a new law that they haven't even written every week for a press conference. It's so clearly an attempt to distract people as we run up to the November elections, right? So first they came up with the idea, we're going to make it so that we defund your budget if you don't do what we want on police. Next, their idea was they had another press conference saying you can't, your city can start de-annexing and neighborhoods can leave the city. Then he came up with this idea of maybe we'll turn them all into state police. Now, in the end, this is political theater. And it further entrenches the status quo and is just an attempt to get people to stop recognizing the real issues that are taking way more lives in our community in Texas, which is the COVID-19 pandemic.
So last week you tweeted that Abbott, quote, has rolled out 3 proposals to attack Austin's police reforms, but nothing about protecting #Black Lives, nothing on extending unemployment benefits, nothing on keeping school kids and employees safe from #COVID. Why do you think Abbott and other Republicans have been so active seeking to roll back police reform, and why would you rather the state be focused on these other issues?
We were at a point in Austin where hospitals were almost overwhelmed with COVID-19 patients. And we were asking the governor every single day to allow us to have rules for masks. I hear constantly from teachers and school staff who are worried about classes reopening without protections for workers. And we're constantly in touch with the state government about announcing protections for our schools. And we heard nothing on masks for so long. We heard nothing on how we're going to take care of those school employees. And now in this moment, he's choosing to pick a fight and punch down at movements for civil rights. It is cowardice. I mean, it is just so clearly political cowardice. And it's so unfortunate because in my district, we're seeing some of the worst impacts of COVID-19. I mean, we have more COVID-19 deaths here than almost any other of the significant causes of death in our city. As a matter of fact, of the 15 biggest cities in the country, Austin and San Jose have the 2 lowest homicide rates in the entire country of those 15 big cities. And we want to remain that way. And we're seeing that so often some of the violence is concentrated in low-income communities that need economic and public health support. So as we see unemployment benefits stop being extended, as we're worried about what's going to happen when we open schools, I just wish the governor would have press conferences about that instead of about punching down at our modern day civil rights movement.
Thanks, Greg. I'd like to turn to Jessica. You've been covering issues around law enforcement and accountability in Texas for a long time, and specifically how law enforcement has previously stymied efforts at reform. What is it about the structure of policing in Texas that makes sheriffs and city police offices so powerful in state politics?
Well, I mean, I think that, the 2 previous speakers were absolutely correct that a lot of this comes down to the power of associations and unions. I think that one of the things that perhaps is more insidious than just their sort of ability to bargain for, more money, more people, more pensions, which then again sort of sucks up the budget, right? So, even in Austin's sort of budget cut, it's important to keep in mind that it's not, the press has sort of dramatically inflated the extent to which this was like a sort of quote sudden defund. And in fact, this was like a progressive and thoughtful proposal that people have been working on for many years. And even so, no one is losing jobs, right? So sort of the deepest concern I think most people have is this idea that people are sort of losing jobs, which I think is more complicated than it seems. But I think that the sort of capture they have is the way in which they control the media. I think one of the things it's pretty easy to note in Texas, and is probably true in many places, is just how heavily local news media is really, I think, strongly biased towards law enforcement and the police. It's extremely conservative leaning. There's very much a lot of features on, to be quite frank, they often lead with features on crime. And I think, between that and a lot of sense on social media, that the problem becomes that when you talk to people, they get this mistaken impression that crime has gone up. Crime has always, right? So sort of people have in their head that crime has gone up, which leads them to immediately view reforms, even when they are well thought out or extremely moderate, to see them as taking away something that they think that they have or have a right to, right? And I think that, the sort of consolidated power of Abbott and the Republican Party, his funders, which of course should always be mentioned, that, Governor Abbott has his coronavirus, quote, task force was, all of his funders, people contributing to his campaign. There was no, almost no one representing workers. Almost, I think there was one health official. So, it's really sort of like all in this pocket of, well, we want to keep things in this way. I think it's very interesting because Texans pride themselves on being independent and sort of, doing what is best for themselves. And yet the grasp that law enforcement has is almost the opposite, right? Like to sort of consolidate law enforcement in this way and create this extremely consistent and misleading message is almost the opposite of what Texans want to think of themselves as.
Thanks, Jessica. Representative Moody, can you respond to what Jessica was describing, especially with respect to the media? Do you feel that pressure, and do you feel that that consolidation around both law enforcement narratives and kind of sticking to kind of crime-driven stories? Does that impact your ability to get change, and specifically like your colleagues' willingness to make bold moves? Up, you're muted.
I knew if someone was going to do that, and I was hoping it wasn't going to be me. I mean, you can go back to, go back to our earliest memories of what we think about law enforcement, right? You're playing cops and robbers, right? I don't recall anybody playing cops and someone who is suffering from severe depression, who is suicidal, right? It's because those issues are more complicated, they're more complex. And so the narrative, when it's simplified, you have that overt pressure put on offices, right? These are the good guys, these are the bad guys. And that discussion needs to be rejected out of hand. And Representative Kassar talked about there are a myriad of issues that we can invest in that we typically call police to handle, that they're unsuited to handle: mental health issues, substance use issues, homelessness, nuisance complaints. So it is a matter of having a more complex discussion with people. And that's really why we tried to work on issues through the Criminal Justice Reform Caucus to broaden the conversation, because the old days of you're either law and order or you're for mass hysteria in the streets needs to end. It is not that simple of conversation. But when it is oversimplified, when you do get that bias, you get that lead in on the local news, it's one that is hard to push back against, because it's so entrenched in who we are. Like we said, we've been doing it since we were kids. So it's a very real problem that we have to continue to discuss and have some uncomfortable conversations with people about.
Thank you. Thank you for mentioning that complexity. One issue I feel like in these stories, and when we talk about what city councils are doing, what county board of supervisors are doing, the media and a lot of folks focus specifically on defunding. They focus on that word, and everything's about defunding and the reducing of police budgets. I'd like to talk about briefly in the Austin budget, for instance, money was reallocated to other social services like food access, violent prevention, and abortion access. What do you think, in either Greg or Jessica, feel free to chime in, what do you think are the most important programs we can focus on funding rather than expanding police budgets to reduce crime and improve public safety?
When I called constituents after the vote and talked and went to neighborhood meetings and town hall meetings, there were certainly some people that were very supportive, a lot of people that are supportive, and then some people who were confused because all they heard about was reductions to one budget, and they didn't hear about and didn't see in the headlines all of the reinvestments that we made. So I think that if and when the community hears and sees that we reinvested into mental health first responders, or that we're putting up a new family violence shelter with the money, then that's when I think it becomes so much more clear why this was the right thing to do. The biggest part of our violence in Austin is family violence. And no matter how many patrol cars go up and down the street, that doesn't prevent family violence happening in the home. And that's why it's so important to have new family violence shelters, so that people have somewhere to go to escape those dangerous situations. But we haven't added a family violence shelter in years. So often, so much money keeps getting sucked up into one place, the police budget, without addressing those other issues. Our reinvestment this year will make it so that when you call 911 in Austin, you will hear the words, do you need fire, EMS, police, or mental health? So that there can be that fourth option for emergency response. We're really committed to both protecting people's civil rights and actually ensuring true public safety where the status quo has been failing us. So we've got to keep on doing our job as Austin to protect civil rights and public safety. And I wish I could say the same thing about the governor.
Jessica, how do we get those stories covered? Especially, we're less than 50 days until the election. There's a lot of noise. How do we break through?
I could probably use advice on that myself. I think that one of the things I've learned a lot about has just been the structures of local government, right? So the intersection between state, county, and city governments. Now, of course, the concern about this is, I think that when journalists write stories, their impulse is sort of to go to the story, right? So the impulse is sort of to write the story about the person in crisis, or write the story, right, about the person who got shot by police. So like the instinct is to go there. And I'm not rejecting that instinct out of hand. But in some ways, it's not unsimilar to the instinct of the local news to say, like, here's the person who was shot in their driveway or carjacked or something like that. In a sense, what people actually need to understand are the ways in which structures, particularly over time, make it very hard to do certain things. So one example in Texas, because Texas is highly decentralized, as a result of years of state governance, things like mental health services are not funded particularly well by the state, right? So Texas has divided itself into various districts, which is how mental health services are allocated. Law enforcement members serve on these committees that allocate mental health services. And so when you call in many places for a mental health bed, particularly in rural Texas, that you simply have, there's a very long waiting list, and you simply have no way to generate that space. And so what we see is this problem where it's not that people don't know that there are individuals who need it, and we don't, the individuals who are suffering do need it, but also there's been an intentional effort over time through the structure to sort of thoroughly defund it and make it actually quite confusing for people when they're trying to access those services. And I feel like those are the kinds of stories, in a way, that people need. Like, who are the politicians who are making this happen and why? Sometimes state politicians have a tendency to reduce everything to a very simple narrative, as we've all discussed, rather than kind of making it about, like, well, why did we decide to structure it this way, and who decided that, how long ago, and how can that change? And I think those are really important conversations.
Awesome. Well, I know you all have to get back to work. I really appreciate you engaging in this conversation, and we hope to have each of you back in the future, because we know this is an ongoing discussion about how we're going to continue to reimagine safety and think about how to best help the most vulnerable people in our communities. So thanks again. Please follow Appeal News on Facebook and the Appeal on Twitter for the latest news. And please join us tomorrow as we discuss the eviction crisis and voter turnout with Representative